Morning everybody, Simon Dixon here for the latest crypto news. So what we're seeing right now is a bit of a scramble from the US government to figure out what to do in reaction to Facebook's cryptocurrency. And one of the things that they're proposing to do right now is an outright ban on large companies creating their own cryptocurrencies. And they define cryptocurrencies as anything that's a digital token that's designed to operate as either a medium of exchange, unit of account, or store of value, or other. So this is a really interesting development. There's a few implications that I think will have to be debated out when the US decide what their policy is and how they're going to do this. So firstly, you can look at a couple of case studies. So WeChat is an example in China. WeChat used to operate an app called, I think it was QQ. I think their first attempt in FinTech, it was the QQ coin. And that started to, have the potential. I talked about it years ago in my book, Bank to the Future, in about 2011. But they decided to disrupt themselves with a new app called WeChat. And WeChat is the predominant app used within China, kind of like the China equivalent of WhatsApp, and places like Hong Kong and China, it's very, very big. But WeChat got into the payment space, and they pretty much disrupted cash in China. And the most common way of paying for goods and services within China is via the WeChat app, and essentially WeChat became a bank and started offering financial services from a tech company. So there is a case study for it. And Alibaba as well with Alipay, not quite, the same thing. But, similar case studies out there in China where Alibaba and WeChat, I think owned by Tencent, if I'm not mistaken, have become really disruptive players in the banking field. So the major difference, I guess, with China is that most of the banks are national banks. They're all run by the government. But in the US and other countries, the government have outsourced the ability to create money to the private banking sector, and the private banking sector gains massive influence over the government because they control and dictate the flow of all money in the economy. Now Facebook is proposing to dictate and dictate the flow of all money, but the difference is they're not using the US dollar, which is a big problem for the US, and this might be the disruption of the US dollar from tech companies. They're planning to peg it to a basket of currencies, and so the US is scrambling together to figure out how they're going to deal with the one. One of the proposals that's come out is that they are planning an outright ban from large tech companies in creating cryptocurrencies. I think they'll pivot on this one, a couple of reasons, because firstly, they'll probably just allow these companies to become banks, and then they can recreate the banking system, and will move away from full reserve that you'd imagine somebody's, if a cryptocurrency is pegged by a basket of assets, then you'd expect it to be backed by those assets, and therefore these tech companies are kind of pushing a non-fractional reserve banking system or financial system, and trying to compete with fractional reserve. One of the things that happened when I wanted to create a non-fractional reserve bank way back in 2010, when we first founded the vision of Bank to the Future, we were told by the regulators that we couldn't operate on full reserves. You have to operate on fractional reserves, otherwise it's a different model, different system. So interesting developments that we're seeing right now is really these tech companies are pushing us towards full reserve. But remember, the full reserve is backed by fractional reserve if it's backed by fiat currencies as well. So anyway, there's a couple of interesting things. One, the effect it will have on the competitiveness of the US state. One of the big mistakes that China made is when they defensively started to try and curve the Bitcoin movement that was happening in China, is they placed an outright ban on exchanges. Now, one of the effects, and something I think they'll reverse in the short future, is that they realized that all of the China population just started using exchanges in Japan and South Korea and Singapore, And essentially, they allowed mining to persist. Bitcoin mining is very big in China, but they banned the exchanges. And so the effect of that was that essentially mining is a way of creating Bitcoins through verifying all the transactions and running hardware. But essentially, that is a non-KYC way of them, people creating Bitcoins without the government controlling all the data. Whereas exchanges, you can implement laws and regulations as the rest of the world has, so that you can get a database of all the data of all the people using cryptocurrency through the KYC and AML policies. So it was a really backwards policy. They allowed the way of creating cryptocurrencies without KYC to persist, but then they took away and banned exchanges of cryptocurrencies, which meant that they lost all the data, and all the data went to Japan, Korea, and Singapore and other places of the world instead. So I think they'll reverse that at some point. And so any big reactionary, what you'll notice is it creates a competitive environment whereby someone else, like Telegram, for example, who's launching their own cryptocurrency, but not operating out of the United States, could end up creating all the data. Now, Telegram is obviously founded by Russian founders, and so the US has a choice. You could either have WeChat that has a global currency that they might roll out. You could have Alibaba, you could have Telegram, and it's a power play essentially between who is going to control the data of the cryptocurrency. Is it Russia? Is it China? Is it the US? But the US is planning an outright ban from large tech companies. They've defined large tech companies as anyone turning over 25 billion. To put that in perspective, Facebook, I believe, turns over about 55 billion. And therefore they're considering it a large tech company. So they want to know what Google's going to do. They want to know what Facebook's going to do. They want to know what the large tech companies are all going to do. Uber, I'd put in that category as well. And if they ban them, I think they could lose control. So essentially, they want the US dollar to be the world reserve currency forever. History has proven that every 50 years, a world dominating currency always changes. Donald Trump tweeted that it's never going to change. It's always going to be the dominant currency forever. And that's never going to change. The point is that countries are now going to determine their policies, and those policies are going to determine which country actually ends up getting this world cryptocurrency that operates within a regulated environment via a centralized entity. And those centralized entities are then going to compete with Bitcoin, which is the only decentralized entity that's too big to fail in terms of the size of the hash power right now, that it would take government budget in order to 51% attack the network. And even then, practically, it's still very hard. But it would cost a fortune in order to do that. So everything's pointing towards countries deciding, I believe, that cryptocurrency policies are now going to dictate the future of politics, who gets elected, which countries are going to be the next world powers. And I personally believe that we're at the end of that 50-year cycle, and at some point I still think the dollar is the most useful fiat currency in the world, but at some point I think we're going to see a shift in power as a result of these currency wars, and the policies that governments set right now, they may get defensive, but I think it's the largest, most dominant traditional fiat currencies that have the most to lose, so they might make the worst policies defensively rather than allowing Facebook to disrupt the dollar. So it's really, really interesting now. Luckily, we have global competition. Luckily, we have global tech companies. So this drives the policy. And as I said, Bitcoin has become this force that's regulating the regulator, giving people an exit from whatever the policy happens. And I think that the market has overreacted, as we've had a bit of a, short-term crash. It doesn't really matter in Bitcoin, happens all the time. But I think the market's interpreting it incorrectly based upon the news that what the impact that this actually has if you follow the money and walk through what's coming next. So that's my quick update. US are going to decide next week what they're going to do, whether they're going to ban, whether they're going to allow Facebook to create their cryptocurrency or not. And also remember that there can be a pushback as well. This is created by a Swiss institution, not necessarily within the US. So there's also these jurisdictional plays. Check out my other videos on my Twitter stream where I talked about how the US tried to gain jurisdiction, and the argument that's happening over Tether and Bitfinex at the moment as a result of the things that they can do in order to try and draw international stablecoins into the jurisdiction of the US. So that's all for me this morning. I'm going to head back to work and working with companies building the future of finance. Over and out.